Ready, Harrison? This is for you especially. So I'm not doing this one on kombucha and fermented foods because I'm going to do a practice one on celiac disease because I have a presentation in my nutrigenomics class, which nutrigenomics is the interaction between the nutrients and foods you eat and your genes or your genetics or your genome. So that's really relevant to celiac disease because there's genetic components for it. And I'm going to go over a case study first that's in the book. So this case study is about a 30-year-old woman. She was having trouble conceiving a child. She was having fertility issues. She had a history of bulimia nervosa, and she also had occasional abdominal pain and frequent bowel movements. They ran some labs on her at the doctor's office, and they found out that she had a mild case of iron deficiency anemia. And they couldn't figure out what was going on, but finally someone was like, okay, let's test her blood and see if she might have celiac disease. So they finally tested that, and then they confirmed the diagnosis with a biopsy of her intestines, and they found out she had celiac disease. And guess what? After she went on a gluten-free diet, she was able to conceive within 8 months. So she was had a healthy pregnancy after 8 months. So that's just a case study that was in the book. Next, we're going to talk about what is celiac disease anyway. So celiac disease is an autoimmune disease, and that means that your immune system has some trouble. So it's an autoimmune disease where exposure to gluten causes an immune response in your intestines, in your small intestines in particular, that damages the microvilli in your intestines. And macrovilli are like finger-like projections, and they look like this kind of, and they increase the surface area for absorption for pretty much every nutrient that you absorb. So that's one of the reasons she was iron deficient, was she wasn't able to absorb the iron in her small intestines as easily. And that causes a lot of issues for people with celiac disease, a lot of malnutrition issues. Especially with people who are undiagnosed and are continuing to eat a gluten-containing diet. So it's estimated that about 1% of the United States population has celiac disease, and of that, there's like almost 90% who go undiagnosed or they're misdiagnosed. Often people are misdiagnosed with things like irritable bowel syndrome, but it's becoming a much more understood and known disease, so I think more people are starting to get diagnosed. But then there's also those people who aren't diagnosed with celiac disease, who have never gotten tested, who think that they have some issue with gluten, and then they go on a gluten-free diet and it's not helping them at all. So that's something that's extremely annoying, is that people think that going gluten-free is a health thing, where it's not. Like gluten, there's nothing wrong with eating gluten if you don't have celiac disease. There's nothing wrong with eating gluten at all. Like, that's, why would you do that? Bread, pasta, pastries, crackers, pizza, all that kind of stuff needs gluten, and gluten is the thing in the bread and in the starches, or in those foods, that like has the elasticity in it, so it makes like the perfect crumb in bread. Like all those little bubbles that are in there are because of the gluten. So gluten is made of 2 proteins, gliadin and glutenin. And people with celiac disease, they're reacting to the gliadin in that protein. Anyway, so symptoms of celiac disease include diarrhea, abdominal pain, cramping, vomiting, constipation, steatorrhea, which is fatty stools. So it means that there's fat in your poop, which is a sign, or a sign of the malabsorption of fat. Like, you're not absorbing fat, so it's just going straight through you, and it's going into your bowel movements. Weight loss, depression, migraines, fatigue, etc. So these symptoms are classic symptoms, but not everybody experiences these symptoms. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of people go undiagnosed. But yeah, a lot of people do experience those. Oh, and dermatitis, hypophomatitis, which is little red dots that can be all over your neck or on your elbows or your knees or your stomach or pretty much anywhere in your body. And they're little red dots that a lot of people with celiac disease get before they're diagnosed or before they're on a gluten-free diet. So the diagnostic steps, we mentioned them a little bit when we were talking about the case study, but basically if you've been on a gluten-free diet for a long time and you need to get diagnosed, the first step is to go on what's called a gluten challenge, and that's basically just to go back on gluten. So you need to be eating foods containing gluten, which is unfortunate if you have a lot of symptoms, but it's necessary for your diagnosis. So the next step is a blood screening. So what they do is they test for an antibody called tissue transglutamase. So the reason you need to be eating gluten is because your body only has an immune response to it if you have gluten in your diet. And if you have elevated levels of tissue transglutamase, then you go to the next step. And the next step is a tissue biopsy. So they take a biopsy of your small intestine and they look for damage. They look for a flattened microvilli and they look for, damage. And then if you have that, if that's confirmed, then you have confirmed celiac disease. So what is the treatment? So there's only one treatment for celiac disease, and that is to go on a gluten-free diet. That is it. So really common gluten-containing foods. So first of all, wheat, barley, and rye are the three grains that contain gluten. So you have to be avoiding those foods. The common foods that have that, of course, are bread, graham crackers, tortillas, beer. Let's see what else. And some less common ones are things like broth, soy sauce, malt. So things like a malt milkshake, you have to avoid that. Vegetable starches, unless it specifically says it's made from corn or another non-gluten containing food, vegetable starches often can contain gluten. So what can you eat? You can eat everything else. There's so many gluten-free versions of all of those foods too. Like there's gluten-free bread, there's gluten-free pizza, gluten-free crackers. So it's pretty easy now to go on a gluten-free diet if you need to. But again, don't do that unless you need to. So other things like legumes, eggs, meat, dairy, all that kind of stuff you can still have. So did we already talk about the genes affected? I don't think so. So people with celiac disease are more likely to have two alleles that are genetic mutations. So those alleles are the HLA-DQ2 and the HLA-DQ8 alleles. If you have those alleles, you're much, much more likely to have celiac disease, but you do not necessarily have celiac disease. You're like 90% likely to though. If you have one or both, if you have both, you usually have a more severe case of celiac disease. If you have one, it's usually more mild, or you have latent celiac disease. Latent celiac disease is something that can be triggered by a stress response. So it can be something like super stressful that happens in your life, and then all of a sudden you're having these symptoms, and then you have celiac disease. Anyway, so these two alleles are super cool because they're genes that can be tested through things like 23andMe, which is a genetic testing company and they test for these alleles, which is super cool. So you can go do that right now, and you don't have to be eating gluten. You can be eating gluten no matter what, it'll test. And then so some updated information on celiac disease. So there's not a whole lot of stuff, a whole lot of new research on like the diagnosis or like, all that kind of stuff, because literally the only treatment for celiac disease is to avoid gluten in your diet. But there is some new research on genetically modified wheat, where it's like very reduced levels of gluten in this wheat, and they can make bread out of it or whatever else, like pizza, which would probably be a lot easier since gluten is very important for bread making. But anyway, genetically modified wheat, so people with celiac disease can enjoy that food again. Who knows what it tastes like in comparison to the gluten-free products that are on the market already, but it's something that's super interesting and super worth checking out. Obviously it's not in the market yet, it's still being tested, but that would be super cool if people were able to like have gluten-containing grains in their diet again, like wheat. But also a study just came out very recently at the beginning of April, where they tested people with celiac disease who are on strict gluten-free diets, and they found out that a lot of these people have gluten in their stool and urine. So that means that even though they're being extremely careful, there's still cross-contamination enough. There's enough cross-contamination to have dangerous levels of gluten in their diet. So these levels, they're unaware of them. They're exposed through cross-contamination, are damaging the intestines of people on gluten-free diets still. That sucks. That's dangerous, and there's like not a lot you can do about that other than being even more careful, which I'm sure a lot of people with celiac disease are very careful. So if you don't get if you have celiac disease and go undiagnosed, there's a lot of health implications on that. So about 25% of people who are just being screened and tested to see if they have celiac disease have liver damage. After they go on a gluten-free diet, their liver usually returns to normal, but other complications can include people with celiac disease, since it's an autoimmune disorder, they're at a higher risk for other autoimmune disorders such as type 1 diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis. They're also at higher risk for kidney damage, type 2 diabetes, and all sorts of other like organ and autoimmune disorders. So it's very important, if you suspect you have celiac disease, to get tested and then go on a gluten-free diet immediately so that you can limit the exposure and limit the damage to your intestines after that. So that is everything with that. I hope you enjoyed this test video. And then the next one that I'll do is on fermented foods. So we'll talk about kombucha and whatever else. And this one was just like a quick like presentation example. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.